how is life for someone in the field of quantum computing? Ilyas Khan.
Right, well, thanks, Gavin. Well, since the early part of 2014, I've actually not done anything else. This is the only thing I do. Right. But I guess by the time you get to a certain age, and your millennial audience will find out in another 100 years, you do get a CV, but this is the only thing I do, and it's the only thing I've done since 2014. I had effectively retired.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. I'm a fellow at Cambridge, and I has really looked forward to focusing on a different life up there.
And your philanthropy is such that you've been knighted by the Pope. Maybe you're winning at life.
Well, yes, right, thank you. And it is all relative. But as I say, once you get to a certain age and you've been working hard for a while. Look, I grew up in the northwest of England in a town called Accrington, in a 2 up, 2 down. And so the only way, really, for any of us was to work hard, yeah. and I did. But quantum computing is something which, for the vast majority of my life, was really something that we could aspire towards, sometimes think about, and maybe up until about 2013 or 14, imagine that there might be a quantum computer by, let's say, 2030 or 2035. Yeah. The actual engineering that is required to build this kind of machine was really hard to imagine.
Yeah.
And that tipping point that I think you're referring to, i.e. how's life, you know, I found myself, and now find myself, I'm like a teenager. I can't wait to get up in the morning. I love what I do.
Yeah. For
the first time in my life, I do something which I love.
It would be like working on the hoverboard, which young people, since Back to the Future came out, people have been waiting for the hoverboard. When you talk about technology is advancing, people go, when can I have a hoverboard?
Yes.
You know? So it's kind of like, well, you're actually kind of working in that, which is actually kind of way bigger than that. But what was the main thing I really wanted to ask you when I was reading up about you, and for me, as a sci-fi fan, my interest was spiked by the cinemascope of these great sci-fi movies that really kind of introduced my brain to the landscape of possibilities. What was the thing that kind of piqued your interest, that got you into the world of quantum computing?
I think it was, well, my interest in quantum computing goes back really to the mid-80s. And that's not changed to the millennial audience, of course, that really is 100 years, the mid-80s. But it was at that time that two very great minds started talking about quantum computing in a language that was computationally accessible. Right. And one was this guy called Richard Feynman. And he started talking about, and in fact published in a journal in February of 1985, an article about quantum computing. And at about the same time, a very fine physicist who's still alive, Feynman's passed away. He was a Nobel laureate. And David Deutsch is the other one, and he's still around in Oxford. I had a cup of tea with him a week and a half ago.
Tell him I said, what's up?
And he was, I will. And he's as much at the edge as he ever was. Yep. But it was this idea that if you can use the most fundamental unit of the universe in order to compute, so if you imagine in our existing computers, we use bits, and collections of bits become bytes. Well, if those bits weren't transistor points, or magnetic specks on some tape, but they were atomic and actually subatomic, what would be the consequence of that? And from different sources, Deutsch and Feynman came to this. And I would say from you mentioned this sort of cinemascope type idea, David's or Deutsch's famous little sentence that he coined in a book in 1997, The Fabric of Reality. He says, well, look, if we were to use a quantum computer to factor a number with 125 digits, then the number of computational steps is 10 to the 500. There are only 10 to the 80 atoms in the visible universe. So this other order of magnitude, because every time you add one, you double.
Yeah.
So to 80 to 500 is more than 80 to 5.
Exponential.
It's and whatever the word is, beyond exponential. He said this takes place in a parallel universe, and David is famous for his views on multiverses, and that has captured a lot of people's minds. Yeah. And it's those kinds of fundamental questions that used to be academic, and now are becoming real.
That's really phenomenal. Wasn't it? Was it Feynman who said the thing about a quantum computer, or was it Deutsch? But a quantum computer would allow us to compute kind of like nature would, like in the manner of nature.
Yes, in different language they both said it, and that's exactly that is exactly right. So when the best example that everybody will understand is that you really are confronting all manner of computation at all aspects of life. So a simple leaf or a blade of grass, when it takes in sunlight, that's right, and it converts that into whatever carbohydrates and oxygen. It is a computational feat. Yeah. And of course it does it without thinking, and more importantly, without blowing up. If we put an equivalent amount of energy into a computer, it blows up. In fact, when we compute, we waste so much energy. Yeah. The computer gets very hot, so the free heat dissipation is very high. And that was neatly, I don't know whether you did that on purpose, but if you did, top marks to you, because that is actually what Feynman was looking at, is how can we be efficient and effective in computation without all this energy being dissipated?
Yeah, which is phenomenal. And so do you think, I mean, because that's a great world to dive into, do you think that quantum computing will bring us closer to understanding what we are, what essentially everything is, or is that too far? Is that like a little further down the road?
Well, first of all, for a universal quantum computer, one that is capable of operating at the maximal efficiency and to be able to compute all the things that we can imagine ever being computed. Yeah. So some of these traveling salesman problem is rather trivial, but computationally very hard, intractable current problem, all the way through to simulating quantum states. Right. So for example, new materials and drug discovery, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Once you get to that level, and let's just say that that's, I don't know, 10 years away or whatever, it doesn't really matter how many years away it is, then yes, I think the motivation for many people in this field has been that we might eventually be able to uncover some of the fundamental truths. I mean, we've never been able to reconcile gravity with quantum mechanics, right, yeah. And perhaps there are truths that will appear. What I do think, however, is that whilst that is a motivating factor for a great many people in the field, quantum computing today has been taken over, and I think rightly so, by commerce. Right. Because people have realized that even on that journey, and let's say it's 10 or 15 years away, along the way we will have...
Still a short time in the grand scheme of things.
Oh yeah, well look from...
Some people would be kind of shocked that it's only 10, 15 years away.
Well, there are some people who think it's less than that.
Yeah.
But, oh yeah, I mean, the journey from what? Apollo 13 to the IBM PC was only 12 or 13 years, so yeah, you're absolutely right. But coming back, so I think that the world of commerce, I mean, people like Google and IBM and Microsoft, etc., yeah. I think what they've realized is that early stage quantum computers, i.e. quantum computers that aren't universal, but where collections of qubits working in superposition and in a state of entanglement, can compute, and what I mean by that is actually do things that are useful that currently can't be done. Right. So I think there will be a stage, and at this stage, I'm not sure that we're going to find out about the sort of the fundamental truth of nature, but yes, it's a journey that will unfold.
Yeah. As we kind of exponentially grow towards...
Yes, yeah.
And you say about qubits, so that's I think is something that I think some people might tap out at when we start talking about qubits. But what's the simplest way to explain qubits? Because essentially when you buy a computer, it's a certain amount of gigabyte, it has a certain amount of space, it has a certain amount of chips in it, it computes at a certain power. So qubits is, I guess, the measurement of of computing power, or how would you?
Yeah, no. Well, first of all, as we discussed before we started this interview, I am a big believer in demystifying quantum computing. There is absolutely no reason for anyone to be concerned about this mysterious thing. And like all, if you were a doctor or a lawyer or a rap musician or a cinematographer, there are language tricks that you play to shortcut. There are words that we use that are common only to that particular field. Yeah. All computers are physical devices, right? So every single computer is made up of some piece of kit. And a qubit is a quantum bit. Yeah. And it is the measure, if you like, or the representation is a better way of putting it, of information. So every time I have a piece of information, a 1 or a 0 or a streaming movie, I can represent that at the moment in a string of 1s and 0s that represent the space they take up on this transistor grid at the moment. In a quantum computer, the equivalent of that unit of information is a qubit. Yeah. That's it.
That's excellent as well, because I mean, where that could take us down the line of this conversation, which is important, I think, is how the amounts of qubits is in the world of quantum computing is starting to shoot through the roof in many terms. You know, I guess there's IBM who have a 5 qubit.
50.
They've got 50 now. I had heard that they had a 300.
50.
50, okay. So I mean, it's already speeding up quite a lot of the kind of the players in the game, which we'll talk about, which you'll be able to talk about at length. But so at the moment, IBM have a 50. There's some companies who say they have ridiculous numbers, and so if you got up to around about 500 qubits, just if you had a computer that had 500 qubit, quantum computer. Would that not be able to compute more information than atoms in a known universe?
Right, so short answer, yes. But maybe demystification comment number 2. So if the qubit was the first one...
Yeah. These are the mysterious things people are going, whoa, no, I can't have that.
Yeah, so I would... The example that I can provide you with, which I think hopefully again... will have some resonance here, is that when we go back to the age of the car, the automobile came about soon after we had steam-driven engines, and even up until recently, people used to refer to cars using the word horsepower.
Yeah.
Right? And the reason for that is when the first engines came about, the best way we could say, well, that's 5 horsepower. And I knew, because I had 5 horses, what that meant. Yeah. And then you get to 10.
Wondered, who's going out and measuring who's got 300 horses to run against your Ferrari? You know what I'm saying?
That's right. So,
but they still stuck with that phrase because it becomes a language.
It becomes a language. That's right. That's exactly right. But not all measures of horsepower were similar. So if you had a 300 horsepower unit in your, let's say, mill, and you were up in Lancashire and you were weaving yarn, well, it would blow up the little hut you were in, right?
Yeah.
And yet if you put it in an engine on a parallel rail and you pointed it that way, right. Shum, suddenly you're taking lots and lots of people and it's doing more than 300 horsepower. So, the point I'm making here is that there are comparisons here which aren't always like for like. So having made that point about the horsepower, coming back to qubits, using the number of qubits as a measure of computational achievement will become, in my opinion, the standard, but it hasn't yet. Right. There are still some people who've got qubits that are language A, and then you've got people who've got qubits who are language B, and they might say, I've got 100, and they've got 10, but they might actually be computationally the same.
Right, okay.
And here's the reason. Are we ready for the reason now? Right, okay.
Ready to be blown.
Oh. Yeah. No, there's nothing to be blown away here. The reason why there are these differences is really, again, down to 2 very simple facts. we don't yet know what the most efficient and effective platform will be for generating qubits. What do I mean by that? When we have a quantum computer, what we are doing is we're generating a qubit, we're manipulating it, and then we're measuring the outcome. So we're generating, manipulating, and measuring. Mm-hmm. Coming back to real existing computers, that's what we do with bits. Yeah. We generate bits with electronic circuits, we manipulate them through gates, mm-hmm. All these logic gates which tell us when I type into my computer, go to Netflix on YouTube or whatever and watch a film of Gavin, well, that's all it's doing. It's setting a set of instructions, yeah. And then the result is a measurement. So in a quantum computer, the ultimate qubit, if it's a subatomic particle, let's say it's an electron, mm-hmm. and our minds don't get small. We get big, we don't get small, and we should come back to that. Yeah, this is the super small. But let's come back to that later. We generate that qubit, and we assume that after we've manipulated it, we haven't lost it, and therefore we can measure it effectively. So if I said 2 plus 2 in a quantum computer, there are some platforms where you only need 2 qubits or 1 qubit to do that. There might be other platforms which need 1,000 qubits to get to the same answer, because there are many ways of generating qubits. And again, this is terminology, but there's one way which is called superconducting, and you don't have to remember this, but you've got to go down to absolute zero in temperature yeah. in order to create the environment for the qubits to be safely and effectively generated, manipulated, yeah. and measured.
And it's at that state where superposition can actually take place, at that temperature where you can actually then...
Well, superposition takes place all the time. It's happening right now, so you yeah. don't need those temperatures. But in the context of human engineering, in order to generate, manipulate, and measure, yes, we've got to get down there. Yeah, superposition happens all the time. It's happening right now. It's happening in these lights that are coming out. Yeah. So there's that particular platform, and then there's another platform where people are using something called an ion trap, just by way of an example, where individual atoms, as the name suggests, are ionized and trapped, and then they're used. And there's another one which is even more crazy, which is using something called an annealing platform, which is one of the early quantum computers that came about. And they generate thousands. I think 2,000 qubits is what they currently generate. But actually, you can't add 2 and 2 on the quantum annealing platform. You just can't do it.
Wow. It's
not made for that. Huh. Right? So that's why I think at the moment we've got all these different... and the other thing is, another terminology, one of the big hurdles will be something called error correction. Yeah. In all computers, there's going to be some error because they're physical things. You know, if I throw a dart 1,000 times, I will miss X number of times. If I'm yeah. a bad dart player, I'll miss 1,000 times yeah. for every one I get right. So for me to get 100 bullseyes, I've got to throw 100,000 times. Yeah. So if a computer, which is the inverse of that, it goes 100,000 times and makes one error, you've got to allow for that error. In quantum computers, we're at that point where error correction methodologies haven't brought parity between the number of qubits being generated and their usefulness. Right. That's ahead of us. So until that happens, and it will happen, these measures of numbers of qubits are rough and ready.
Right.
But now coming back to numbers of atoms in the known universe, it is clear that a quantum computer, with 50 logical qubits, i.e. those that can be used, yeah. would be more powerful than any supercomputer in existence. Yeah. And by the time you go to 51 qubits, remember you've doubled the computational power. So when you get from 50 to 60, you're not going from a 20% increase, you're actually doubling 10 times. So it's an order of magnitude. Yeah. So by the time you get to 80 qubits or 300 qubits, famously, and I can't take credit for this, but if you had all the computers in the world and you magically connected them together with a power source from the sun, you still wouldn't get the equivalent computational power.
Oh.
because as you've said rightly, that is more than there are atoms in the known universe, observable universe.
So then, bringing it to...
But we're a few years away from that.
Yeah. So bringing it to practical uses then, what exists right now? And what is the kind of, I guess, what exists right now? What can be done right now? And what is, you know, the kind of time scale to actually something that can be practical in everyday life?
So at this point, I think we just need to diverge between quantum computing and quantum technologies.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The most practical application in the very short term is likely to be quantum technologies. So quantum metrology, quantum clocks, which will be the most accurate clocks in the world.
Then
Quantum.
I'll be able to get time a lot more often.
But you know, the use is obviously in the world that we live in, especially if you're trying to control the Internet of Things and you need things to happen exactly at the right time, and you might have just infinitesimal nanosecond changes. You know, all of these things become important. Quantum metrology is interesting for lots of reasons, but of course, you know, we're tracking objects at the moment. For example, if you've got this, the best example it's always used is a good example is when you've got this submarine under the oceans and it's, you know, tracking all the time. It's not about us on the surface knowing where it is, it's about those buggers knowing where they are. Yeah. So, you know, these things become much more effective and they can stay down longer and more effective from the point of view of their operational control. And one of the biggest changes will be quantum random numbers, because at the moment, the world, humankind up until now, has never been able to generate true randomness. And we use randomness in many ways. Yeah. For example, when we, in a trivial way, when we go online and we play poker and we get our hand dealt to us, that's some random seeding in a quantum software program. All the way through to very complex and important things like defense and security. Yeah. There is a view that Moscow's inequality, which is another terminology that should not scare you, but it's basically a way of describing, do you remember Moore's law? Yeah. So that was one way. So Moscow's inequality is not about computational power, but it says that there's a point at which you have to change your method of encryption and you have to become quantum resistant. Right. Because at some point, quantum computers will crack existing methods of encryption. Yeah. And Moscow's inequality says that look at your data and for how long do you want it to be secure? Yeah. So if you are a mad dictator running a spy network, in 5 years' time, you still want to maintain secrecy about what you know now. Yeah. Because some of those people running around are still going to be alive. Yeah. So I'm using an extreme example. Yeah. So you've got to look at how long you want your data to be secure for. And then you've got to add to that the amount of time it will take you to transition. So from one method of encryption to another. Large embedded organizations don't change overnight. Yeah. It takes years. When you add those together, is that greater or less than the time when quantum computers will break your existing codes? Mm. If that time is less than, you better change now. And that is dawning on lots of people. The best way of securing your, should we say, I shouldn't say securing, enabling encryption is to have a quantum source of randomness in the first place. Yeah. So that is now available. That doesn't need a quantum computer of lots of qubits. That can be built today in a device that's probably not much bigger than,
Oh wow, that's great. So I can lock up all my computers, all my records that no one's heard yet. I can just lock them up in encryption. All my Bitcoin, all my cryptocurrencies, just lock them up. Get this quantum device to. But you inadvertently have hit on an interesting thing that millennials will be interested in. I was going to come to this.
I wasn't going to go to Bitcoin. You have to. Right. There's a difference, but we can get there. There's a difference between the lock and what's in the safe. You see, a lock stops you getting in. I'm talking about the encryption, which is a lock. There's a whole separate conversation about the integrity of what's in the bloody safe.
Wow. Okay.
That's a whole different conversation.
So let's get to security in a while, because I would say there's so many possibilities for certain industries.
But can I go back, sorry, because so you're right, I shouldn't have gone on too much about security. From a quantum computing standpoint, you said...
a big point about it.
Yeah. But on quantum computing, early stage use is quantum chemistry. So in the next 2 years, perhaps even in the next year, there are now and there will be quantum processors, quantum computers, with sufficient number of qubits, which are not universal, they're not fault tolerant, or they're not effectively fault tolerant, but still will be useful. And there's a consensus now that quantum chemistry is the area that should be focused on to make use of those machines, where they will become better or faster, or in some cases will do things that existing computers cannot.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty of the possibilities then of quantum computers in industries, because I can imagine that it's gonna, the revolution that's gonna happen in technology with quantum is gonna transcend and expand business in many ways, or I don't want to say business, but just the ways that we solve problems in just about every field, I could imagine. So what would you say, if we went through them, so like you were saying about chemistry, if you said medicine, what's the application of quantum computers in the medical world?
In the foreseeable future?
In the foreseeable future, the close and then maybe a little bit down the line.
Oh, well, first of all, we are living through the second industrial revolution. I know that it's fashionable to say that there was the industrial revolution and then there was the electronic revolution.
Yeah.
Well, there was a middle one with automobiles and transport and heavier than air flight, and then obviously computers. But fundamentally, we had the industrial revolution, and the consequences of that have been felt for all of us for 300 years now. This is the next industrial revolution, and we are living through it. And most of the people who are listening to this will live long enough to see the consequences. And not just, I was going to say in my opinion, but it's now very clear that this will have a much greater impact on our lives than was the case of our great grandparents or great great grandparents.
Yeah.
Who lived through those years when the Industrial Revolution was mechanical,
yeah.
when we used machines to do things that we couldn't. Now, in fact, instead of saying which areas, I would say it's hard to find an area where it won't have an impact.
Yeah.
And I would say 2 quick points, and then perhaps you can guide me to where you want to go. One quick point is that truly, I don't think anybody alive knows how quantum computers will be used, because in all their magnificent diversity, smart human beings will find uses. It's a bit like when that block of a telephone first came in the late 80s and 90s. We could not have imagined how we... So I would make that point as a caveat.
Which is a good thing and a bad thing, because we don't know. We'd love to think that the world's full of great minds who just want to solve issues and solve problems, but history tells us that there's also some negative, evil minds out there who want to, you get your superheroes and you get your supervillains, always. It's the kind of almost the balance in the world is that you have like a lot of people who are good and some people who love chaos and want to use technologies for their own betterment. So if we go through some of the technologies, unless you wanted to finish off that point.
Well, you've obviously now gone into some...
I'm going to open a rabbit hole.
No, it's more metaphysics, this, I think. Yeah. But to finish the other point then, and there's no way I can respond meaningfully to what you just said. Yeah. The areas where I think we are on solid ground have been well articulated. And in fact, people like IBM and Microsoft have got wonderfully produced little short videos that articulate this. But for the purposes of today, I would say that we will be in an energy surplus world. There is no question about this. Yeah. Now, is it 10 years away or 20 years away? is debatable. Our dependence upon hydrocarbons will disappear. I'm not saying that we won't use them at all, because obviously there's a legacy infrastructure that will continue to burn hydrocarbons, and they'll be used in other ways, petrochemicals, for example. But I think that we will be able to transport electricity without it being wasted. Or at least magnitudes more effective, and that itself is transformative. And then just think about photosynthesis and the conversion of solar energy into power opens itself up.
Right now must be enjoying the hell out of it.
Yeah. Well, and also there's negatives. I mean, all these people are banging on about wind and et cetera, et cetera. You know, it's a very expensive way of doing it. Ultimately, we can harness the atmosphere around us. But I'm not an expert in this area, so I don't. But that's one area. So energy. Yeah. Another area is clearly the mapping of the genome and the associated issues of protein folding, which then lead to personalized drug and drug discovery.
Which is incredible.
And this has got two big forks in the road, which is incredible. So I'm now not talking about longevity and living forever. There may be some physical barriers that we will never overcome, but there's no reason not to believe that things like diabetes and Alzheimer's, which are currently very topical, and there are many others, Parkinson's and cancer, should not become easily tractable through personalized attention. And then the third area, artificial intelligence, whatever that means. And I think that the ability for machines to see what we cannot be underestimated. Now, you and I both wear glasses. So we currently have machines that help our eyes see better than they would unaided. And you can multiply that, and when you get to the issue of a computer, the ability of large data to contain useful information that can be actually harnessed as opposed to ignored is, I think, another area. So these are three big topics that clearly are on the horizon.
And do you think, I mean, just recently 15,000 scientists had issued a letter out to the world basically warning that with climate change we've gone potentially too far. Do you think quantum computing might be a very powerful tool in helping maybe reverse some of the problems, or at least slowing down the effects of climate change?
So I think that's the first question you've asked me that I cannot answer. I would take a take. That really is. I'm sorry. And it would be foolish of me to pretend. I'm too old to pretend.
But it's one of
what
the
I
great
would
hopes.
say, exactly. What I would say is that I'm an optimist, and I hope that these 15,000 scientists are wrong about the tipping point, and that clearly we are culpable as a species for many of the effects that are around us, not all, but many. And I think rather than debating and wasting our time about saying that Trump's an apologist and he's a denier, or that climate change is or isn't caused by humans, I think that's a waste of time. I think really let's look at how things like quantum computers will mean that we are not consuming these resources that are finite in a manner that is harmful to the environment. The great thing is, Gavin, we won't have to guess. It takes the guesswork out of it. Now, beyond that, there could be a solar flare next year that we don't know about.
But like the random potential of the future doesn't have to be as random and as dangerous with the help of.
So now you're getting into quantum. Now you're getting into superposition.
I go into some of the stuff, but so like you said earlier about what strikes me is that quantum computing is already so powerful. It's already a movement that's in full swing.
It is in full swing. It's the biggest industrial wave right now, and it hasn't even started.
And I don't see that there's. I mean, like you said earlier, it isn't really a case of, we better, make our, entrepreneurs and everyone in the fields of business and just life in general, we're not getting involved just yet. So you have to. we're kind of at the stage maybe, or we're going to be at very soon,
Well,
that you're going to have to go quantum.
I'm not sure I agree with the premise there. I think that the constituency of informed, educated, and people equipped, I don't mean with intellect, but with the resources to become active on this, that is happening. When one of the world's largest companies, I don't know whether it is the largest, it's Microsoft, it perhaps is still behind Google and Apple, but give or take, it's one of the biggest companies in the world.
They're doing all right.
And I think Microsoft, alongside Google, when they decide that the strategic future of their business is quantum, and when somebody like Alibaba comes out in the public domain and says, we will be spending $15 billion on artificial intelligence and quantum technologies, and when you get governments who've realized, there's a European flagship fund, the UK, by the way, is in a very, very good position, thanks in large part to the foresight of people who set up the Quantum Initiative around about 2010. So I think that actually people do know. So again, the analogy maybe with the lives that some of us have gone through, if you were around in about 96, 97, 98, the internet that we came to know in 2004, 5 and 6 wouldn't have existed had the investment in infrastructure not have happened. And obviously telephony is another example, cars are another example. So I think that it's not necessary for the average jazz musician or a first violinist at the London Symphony to be too concerned at the moment about that, because they've got more important jobs to do.
But if they're storing their compositions on their computers and say they write one of the greatest compositions of all time, they might need, and you've got hackers out there who are versed in the world of quantum, hacking.
Well, I take a different view. I think actually the advent of quantum computing will allow us to be able to take advantage of this mass movement of data. Instead of worrying, I worry all the time right now. I worry for good things and for bad things, little things and small things, whereas true quantum encryption, and this is really where we're going to get to, when I send you information in the future, not only will it be encrypted, but the information itself will be transported in a quantum mechanical manner, or according to the rules of quantum mechanics. And at that point in time, actually we're in a good place. So, okay, the journey from here to there, clearly there are lots of people, not me, I'm not built like that and I'm not paid to do that, but there are some very good people in positions of authority who do worry that bad people will get a quantum machine prior to these safeguards being put into place. Right? And thus it ever was. When Oppenheimer went off and the Manhattan Project took fruition, well, they were thinking, will the Germans or the Japanese get a machine and will we have a bomb on Manchester? It is conceivable that the first atomic bomb could have been detonated, amongst the Allies on a city or a conurbation somewhere that is dear to us. But it wasn't. Now, leaving aside the argument, which is a very big argument as to whether Oppenheimer ever wondered, and he spoke very rarely about this, the need to explode. There's a difference between having the capacity versus using it. I think in this day and age, with this technology, and we're still manipulating atoms here, or subatomic particles, and we shouldn't stretch the analogy too much, but there is an analogy here, which I think is that groups of governments have been aware of the potential for quantum computing for a very long time.
And they're kind of on board already. They've already started.
Well, they've been funding it. Here in the West, the Chinese it's difficult to because there's a degree of opacity. It's neither good nor bad, but it just is the case. No, I think if you look at the United States and you look here, programs like IARPA, the Department of Defense in the United States, here the Quantum Hub program, these were funded by governments, and they were funded in partnership with universities. So people were anticipating that these changes would happen. What is now apparent is that the timelines have shifted.
Right.
I think that's what is becoming apparent.
That's quite amazing. So, So it could be, because I think I know I've heard of China has satellite systems that run on quantum programs. America's defense has a I don't know if they have a D-Wave computer or whether they have something similar. But there seems to be like it's already at the stage of, you know, if if governments are taking it that serious, and really like that is maybe the future of defense or the future of so many different...
So at the moment it's more focused on communications,
yeah.
which is more focused on quantum technologies. And I think that these are enabling tools. These are essential steps. They're the equivalent of the optical fiber networks that allowed for broadband to exist. They're the equivalent of opening up of the airwaves for Wi-Fi, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these things that are happening now, such as the quantum secure communications through satellites that the Chinese have established, these are all things which are very tangible steps leading towards the ultimate adoption of quantum computers rather than simply quantum technologies.
Yeah. So is there a field or an industry so far that you're most excited about the application of quantum computers? What's the one that kind of is like, I can't wait till we take off in here?
Well, yes, there is, and so how long's your tape? I mean, but if I had to, so if I had to choose a couple, I would say that if we took, maybe rather than my opinion, I think I can say this without fear of contradiction. If we took the top 500 people in this field and we were able to calibrate that language so that it became uniform, then I think that at least in the next 3 years, over the next 3 years, there is the greatest excitement around the use of early stage shallow circuit quantum computers that would allow quantum software to be created for use in quantum chemistry, so that new materials can be designed that would otherwise either take a very long time or simply not be possible due to the nature of that computational challenge. Right. I think that's a safe place to focus our attention in the short term. I know, because we're working on it as well, that not far behind is this field called quantum machine learning. And there's beginning to be some early views that smaller quantum computers, again, not these big universal machines that will ultimately be able to do everything that we've talked about, but the early stage machines at some stage, sooner rather than later, so 5 years rather than 10, and maybe even earlier than 5 years, will be able to tackle machine learning, because this idea of the creation of this unsupervised network of learning, you know, the neural networks that are currently being run off these GPUs, these will be enhanced sufficiently for us to gain value out of them in areas such as optimization, right? Yeah. So a good example, well, okay, there are lots of examples of that, so I won't go into that. So I think those are two things which are relatively easy to reconcile. And the one I mentioned right at the beginning, quantum random numbers. Yeah. Quantum random numbers, do not underestimate that. It's so easy for it to go, oh, why would I bother? Yeah. Why would I bother? No, it is ubiquitous around us. Yeah. If you're, in most cases, when a supercomputer is purchased, it is used in conjunction with some sort of randomness for it to do what it has to do.
Right, which is kind of, that for the layman is kind of mind-blowing to be kind of using randomness to optimize. It seems like the words seem like they're kind of
and your intuition is fantastic. What I find is, even from the most educated people, why would quantum randomness be any better? And it's the wrong question. Yeah. It's not that it's any better, it is fundamentally random. Yeah. And when you and your competition shift, everybody shifts. And to take a trivial example, if you are, I don't know these brand names, but if you're in Las Vegas and I don't know, you've got these rows of these one-armed band. Well, they're no longer like this. You have to push buttons now. But I don't know how often and how many variables they go through, and so therefore how often they have to be reseeded. Yeah. Well, of course, if one of the competition suddenly never has to reseed because he's got this source of quantum randomness that keeps the system going and refreshed and secure, do you really think all the others are going to say, oh, I'm all right with my suit, or but that's what happens in entrenched systems. People just, it's so easy to be negative.
Which is, it mostly stems a lot from the kind of lack of understanding the language, lack of understanding, knowing, the full scale of it. But so what would you say then, from the kind of, rather than the kind of business world or the kind of the creative kind of technological world, as for the kind of normal everyday person, like a funny example would be, because we're talking about optimization, people will be thinking, oh great, I can optimize my life, which is what the labels immediately a normal person like me jumps to every time. Will Cortana be a sexy, beautiful woman who will love me and make my life the great life it could be, so I don't have to live 18 lives that I am doing right? So will your kind of computer software, quantum computer, be able to assist your life in ways that it just can't right now? Or is that not really a kind of applicable?
No. I think it's a fantastically fair question, and this is a good example where I'm afraid many of my colleagues in the industry will shrug their shoulders and say, and I do have a beef with that. I mean, I think that why else would we bother with transforming our lives? I think what we can say, however, so yes, it ultimately, the increase in the sophistication and depth as well as the scope of activities that are currently intractable, when things like that happen, then some smart kid will find a way of solving those problems. I don't think, however, that we should think of a quantum computer as something that we will own. I think it's just never say never. I think that these services will be delivered alongside what we might call high performance or supercomputers. I do honestly, truly believe that for the coming decades, for, 50 years or more, existing classical computers have a role to play. And I think it's more a question of supplementing in those areas that we can't do well. I can't imagine you're going to run an Excel spreadsheet on a quantum computer. But your issue about language, natural language, so if I were to say to the successor of Alexa that I'm really feeling depressed, at some point, might there be a sensible way other than calling up the Samaritans? Right? So these are really interesting questions. And the answer's got to be, I hope so. But I don't think this is, it's not something which we can really put our hand. At the moment, we're still looking at applications which are more, should we say, product, i.e. new materials, drugs, energy, as opposed to quality of life.
Well, the reason I ask it is because if you look at a lot of companies right now, a lot of startups, many of which kind of fuel the self-help idea that that humans live with. We want to better ourselves. So I couldn't imagine having a conversation about quantum computers and not see how humans will want to use a phenomenal technology, even if it's through the medical, being able to treat yourself with a thing that's wrong with you specifically, which is phenomenal. I see that as quite a massive thing that for the normal people to be awaiting is.
But even this is it's a really good point. So my response to that, I think, is to look at, let's say, in the United Kingdom, the National Health Service. The idea that a quantum computer or quantum computing resources could help provide a solution to make more efficient a very long-standing problem called the nurse scheduling problem, and it's as silly as it sounds, but it is a description of a mathematically intractable issue at the moment. It's a real issue over thousands of hospitals, tens of thousands of people working, and how do you maximize that scheduling problem? It's at the moment we do it on a local basis. Now, it is entirely possible for that to be optimized with what I would describe as a quantum computer that is closer to universal than the ones that we will have in the short term. So we're not talking about 2, 3 or 4 years, but we are talking about, in my opinion, less than 10 years. Now that will have an impact on our lives.
For sure.
And the other interesting thing on the NHS is that when we currently, at the moment, we call it 111, and it's a triage system and it's a tree-based logic. It is fabulously effective for what it does. I know most people say, oh, well, it tells me to go to A&E. Well, of course it will, because for 90% of the time, that's probably the right answer. But it's the 4 or 5% where it's critical and it saves lives, that's where it matters. So if we can make that 1% better, 2% better, that'll have a massive impact. So I think those are the areas that we should really focus on. They're not sexy. People don't talk about them. You don't get articles written about this in Vogue. But
so we're not going to have iPhones, super quantum computers walking around on our but certain worlds and industries are going to be optimized that will affect lives for the better.
Well, when you went like that, you reminded me of of this young boy who said, well, you know, that's going to be my phone. No, my hand's going to be my phone.
Yes,
or perhaps the
recall.
So, and of course, if that's plugged into the cloud, then part of it's because you might not need any numbers. You might say, you know, call Leanne or whatever, and it'll call her. And so
you talked about quantum implants.
No.
Please
but
do that for me.
but that, whatever the methodology is in the future, maybe that's 20, 30 years away. The point is that yes, if we've got that amount of information floating around in the cloud, then the effective management of that in an artificially intelligent way, yes, that is something we can aspire to with extra computational power. But that is. I don't think we should really, I mean, we can aspire to it, but I think that journey from here to there, which is many years, I think there'll be still things which are much more interesting and will change our lives along the way before we get there.
So three really important areas. We've touched on one, which we'll probably end on because it's the funnest. But 3 areas I think are really incredible when you start throwing the word quantum in is some nanotechnology. The ability to work on smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. How do you see quantum affecting that? I was just joking there about an implant that goes in your eye. You know, that would probably be. Is that too big a way of thinking, or will it be smaller? Will there be a bug that will fly in and kind of monitor us, or a dust?
Well, that's the second question you've asked that I can't answer. No, I'm an experimentalist. When I walk into I'm not an experimentalist. When I walk into a lab, you know, test tubes break of their own volition. No, I think that the point you've made, which I think is a good one, is that the very reasons that we can now engineer machines that can work at the level of a single photon, and a single photon is a single unit of light, the smallest unit it's a subatomic particle. And is it in fact a thing or a force? I mean, our language isn't equipped to describe it. But for the very reason that we can contemplate doing that, we can contemplate doing many other things. So, you know, at the beginning of this conversation, we talked about engineering advances that are now allowing us to build quantum computers, whereas for the last 35 years, we can only dream. So that technology could be applied elsewhere, not just to build a quantum computer. So I think that's a valid point. But the quantum world works on a different set of rules that nobody really understands. And so I would be cautious about thinking of engineering at that level.
Right.
That is not something that I can imagine.
But could you see, because you said something there that was really interesting about, so the nanotechnology has kind of allowed us to work further into the quantum field, but then with being able to build better and better quantum computers, using quantum computers on quantum computers to build more, do you think?
No. So a nano, however mind-blowing nano is, it is orders of magnitude larger. It is still macroscopic. It is not quantum. So in your iPhone or my iPhone, forgive me, I can't remember the exact number. There's some 4 or 5 billion transistors, and I think the gate integrity of the transistors at that level, I'm told, are thousands of times thinner than a human hair. But even then, they are not quantum. Yeah. The difference between that orders of magnitude is a pomegranate and the Earth.
Yeah.
You know, you're talking, and perhaps more actually. And a good way of looking at this, and I'm this is a well-known analogy, but for your audience might be interesting. When we look at, let's say, an apple or a grapefruit, and we say, how many atoms are there in there? Well, of course, we could say, well, there are as many atoms in that grapefruit as there are blueberries if we were to fill up the sphere of the Earth with blueberries. Now, filling up this room with blueberries is unimaginable. Filling up, let's say, Mount Vesuvius might be, or Everest, but the whole Earth as a sphere still has less blueberries than there would be atoms. Now, hang on, we're not finished yet. That's just atoms. We weren't talking about atoms. Yeah. We're talking about subatomic particles. And at the center of each atom, the nucleus is thousands of times bigger than the electron that's orbiting at the periphery. It's mostly space.
Yeah.
So we're already talking about orders of magnitude smaller, because a single atom isn't 5,000 or 10,000 times smaller than a human hair. It's many more magnitudes. Yeah. So nanotechnology, yes, let's get excited. We should be excited. It's not quantum.
No.
Now, for that reason, we cannot manipulate these and use these for engineering purposes. What we can do is benefit from their computational power.
I think just saying that has already done something in my head of the understanding of quantum, and that will do so much for so many other people. And another, which increases the language and the understanding of things, so people aren't so freaked out about being, what they might think might happen if you're working at such a small level. We'll be able to see time at a Planck distance, and it's not relative anymore, and we'll create other parallel dimensions and stuff, which starts to.
Well, time travel is a legitimate conversation, but not just because of quantum computing, but because of quantum mechanics. So
yeah. Which we can't even possibly go into here, because that would be another couple of hours. But so another field which...
No, that would be your third victory. That would be the third question that I...
That would be the third victory. 3 strikes with that. But another field which I know a lot of my friends and a lot of people in the business world right now you can't avoid is the cryptocurrency landscape. So
how long has it taken us to get?
Just a short. I know. I had it up here, and then we jumped around, But yeah, so the cryptocurrencies. I mean, using the blockchain. What's quantum's impact going to be on that?
Yeah. So I, as you can imagine, I get asked about this a lot.
Who's winning the war?
Yeah.
Or cryptocurrencies?
Yeah. Neither. So I think that cryptocurrencies are just another form of data that is secure, and the application of that security has taken advantage of the limits of existing computation. So if you let's just forget for a second about a cryptocurrency. If I sent you a message and it was encrypted using good old-fashioned RSA encryption methods, which is basically prime factors, I could be just as secure as any Bitcoin security if I used a big enough integer, because in the billion years it would take an existing set of computers to find those prime factors, we'd all be fried. So there'd be no point, right? So there's really no difference between methods of, or different applications of methods that take advantage of the limits of of classical computing. Now, obviously, in the case of a distributed ledger, you then further solidify the structure because of the way in which you are at a granular level linking these encryption methodologies, and you're locking them up, hence the blockchain. Mm-hmm. Now, the fact is that for any token that I'm exchanging, it could be an Amazon voucher or it could be a Bitcoin, the biggest vulnerability in the short term is the point at which it goes from me to you, or it goes into a wallet, or So no matter what the nature of the crypto data, whether it's a coin or whether it's a token, it is currently vulnerable, as all other communications are, from a quantum computer. This is not a secret. There's lots of papers written about it, and in fact there are people out there who are trying to build a quantum resistant currency. Now, my view is that there'll just be a wholesale shift. You know, as soon as we get to the stage of people not talking about it, but converting to quantum resistance, then you have longevity. The whole point about a currency is got to have longevity. The dollar, pound, whatever, been around, multi-generational, and that's what gives them their value. You do not buy currencies or give value to currencies or gold or houses if assets don't have longevity. Yeah. So this is about longevity, and so I don't think there's anything special about Bitcoin or crypto. Distributed ledgers are a different issue. Right. There's a very interesting article that's doing the rounds at the moment that was written by the Singularity Hub, which is connected to Singularity University, which talks about the threat faced by distributed ledgers from quantum computers. That type of quantum computer, the size and scope of that computer is a few years away. It really is a few years away. My response, therefore, to people when they ask me is a very simple response. I say, look, if you're the chief executive, and again, let's forget about crypto and blockchain for a second. If you're the chief executive or the chairman of a very large company, and let's just use, by way of example, you're in charge of Siemens. You're making plans, you're making investments, you obviously are looking at your business on 3 and 5 year cycles. So if you make a decision to do X, you have to say to yourself today, what will be the impact on X of quantum technologies? Yeah. Do I need to take that into account or not? And if so, what do I need to take into account?
Yeah, how do you write a SWOT analysis of your company?
Yeah, without doing that, yeah. So similarly, anybody who's taking into account a distributed ledger as a part of the fabric of the value has to take that into account. Yeah. And there's lots of literature out there. This is not a tutorial, but the short answer is that clearly, depending upon how long longevity is, you have to be quantum resistant. Yeah. I think that, personally, that over the course of the next 12 to 18 months, individuals will be advised by governments to become quantum resistant. Yeah. Because we can't leave this to individual, should we say, emotional response. There are many people who are involved in cryptocurrencies who get religious about it, and they start shouting at you if you so much as suggest that there might be a, and how can you, so you can't leave it to the individuals. You've got to top down say, look guys, look, it's a bit like saying, we've got a road system and you're going to drive on the right, and if there's a red light, you're going to stop. Because if you drive on the left and he drives on the right and I drive in the middle, and when it's red you stop and when it's red I go, there's chaos. So for those reasons, there will be some prescriptive measures put down. Yeah.
There has to be, and that kind of slightly brings it to the last one, I think, which is my funnest to talk about. From a fan of sci-fi and also a fan of just theories in general. We talked earlier just briefly about AI, and so you obviously must have heard of Nick Bostrom and all these people. And there's these people who are on ethics committees who are trying to and like you said, Stephen Hawkins, I don't know if we said that beforehand, but people who might take the point of view that we need to take a little bit of a step back, a slow down here. If we perhaps turn on a quantum computer, a super AI using a quantum computer, we might be in a little bit of trouble. We might have passed a point of no return. Now, Nick Bostrom's a phenomenal mind. He's very hard in his papers to disprove. He's hard to read. He's very dense in the way he writes, but he's quite a mind in the field. Do you think, and this is an ethics question, I guess, but do you think that there's they are right in their worry about, because AI is something that's quite phenomenal if we think about it. Super AI is the thing that I think people are scared of, especially if you have quantum computing power. So what's your view on, are they right? Are they right to be worried about a super AI and a quantum computers making AI super AI that could cause us a lot of problems? Are they right to be worried about mass businesses being able to do things with quantum computers over their competitors?
Yeah, so I think that on both sides of the debate, it's too easy to trivialize. And my first response is I think it's really important for me to be respectful, even if I disagree.
Yeah.
So it is a very fertile and active area of discourse. I have some dear friends, people that I value both intellectually and personally, who do think that there's an existential risk.
Yeah.
Now, my take on this is, first of all the things I'm going to worrying about that's a bit like worrying about the weather forecast on Mars tomorrow. I mean, is it going to be really hot or really cold? I don't know. So, and as I say, respectfully, I think that there are lots and lots of things for us to worry about.
Yeah.
Now, from a societal standpoint, for the same reason that we have a debate about guns, and Donald Trump the other day said, well, it's not the gun that's at fault, it's the bloke that shot it, and taking the opposite view, Obama would have said, well, actually, we're in a position of authority and we should regulate because there are psychopaths out there, and so they shouldn't get into their hands. Now, and we talked earlier about Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project. So clearly, whenever you have such powerful weapons, and they don't have to be powerful, sometimes they can be kitchen knives.
Yeah.
There was that idiot that ran over the bridge in London. So these questions, I think, are very valid. When it comes to existential risk, however, I believe that harnessing these technologies in the foreseeable future for betterment is going to be the defining feature, just as technology has over the last few years, in fact, the last decades. And I also think that we are very, very, very far away from sentient machines. And perhaps my oldest boy is 12. Perhaps when he's my age, and he's 105, then he might start worrying about sentient machines.
Yeah. And he's going to have to send someone back.
To get me. That's right. So I'm not preoccupied by those issues. Yeah. And I wake up in the mornings with a very positive mindset. And I look forward to, defeating cancer and doing away with bloody diabetes and making sure that we don't have to burn hydrocarbons and having machines that can beat humans at chess and, with clever moves rather than just mechanical brute force. Those are the things that I think we should be concerned about. And that's what I focus on, as opposed to some malevolent system that's going to snuff us out.
And I'm looking forward to sexy Cortana, solving my problems, and goddamn hoverboard.